New Orleans. The year is 1718, and a French-Canadian naval officer has just dragged 30 prisoners into a swamp to build a city. They cut cane along the riverbank with hand tools, built crude shelters from tree bark. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds so thick you could taste them. Within months, many of those men were dead. Most settlements would have been abandoned. But over the next 8 decades, the French, the Spanish, enslaved Africans, and the swamp itself would turn this impossible outpost into one of the most extraordinary cities in the Americas.
I use modern AI tools to reconstruct colonial New Orleans at key moments in its history, all based on historical records, period maps, and surviving architecture. We're going to move through the streets, stop at specific buildings, and get a feel for what it was like to actually be there.
Because this city was built on something most cities try to hide: death, slavery, disease, fire. And somehow from all of that darkness, it created a culture the world has never stopped celebrating. This is where it begins. A bend in the Mississippi River, 33 leagues from the Gulf of Mexico. The land is barely above water. Behind the riverbank, there's nothing but swamp stretching to the horizon. Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne de Bienville chose this spot because it was defensible. Access to the river, a path to Lake Pontchartrain through Bayou St. John. Good strategic thinking. Terrible place to live. But Bienville wasn't building this city for the people living in it. He was building it for a con artist in Paris. A Scottish gambler named John Law had convinced the French crown to let him sell shares in the Louisiana colony. He told European investors that Louisiana was a paradise: gold, silver, fertile land, unlimited opportunity. Propaganda paintings showed the colony as a lush European garden. Investors poured money into his Company of the West, and share prices rose 2,000% in a single year. The reality? Bienville's men were living in mud huts, drinking river water and dying of dysentery. In 1719, a flood covered the entire settlement. Workers refused to follow orders. Supplies from France arrived late, or not at all. The governing council, back in Biloxi, actually tried to shut the whole project down and move the capital somewhere else. They said New Orleans wasn't viable in the long term. Colonial officials wrote letters back to Europe saying exactly that. And they were right. It wasn't viable. Not without one thing. In 1719, the first ships carrying enslaved Africans arrived at the company plantation in what is now Algiers Point, directly across the river from the French Quarter. Around 6,000 people were forcibly taken from the west coast of Africa, many from the Senegambia region, and brought to Louisiana during the French colonial period. Without slavery, New Orleans would not exist. That's not opinion. That's the assessment of historians who've studied the colony's records. European contract workers died or left for better land. Only forced labor could keep people working in these conditions. Enslaved Africans built the levees, dug the drainage ditches, cleared the forests, and raised the buildings that turned a swamp into a city. The con man in Paris eventually lost everything. In 1720, the Mississippi bubble burst. Share prices collapsed. John Law fled France, and the colonists he'd lured across the Atlantic with promises of paradise were abandoned to their fate. But the city he'd accidentally funded didn't die. It grew. In 1721, a French military engineer named Adrien de Poja was ordered to draw up plans for the new settlement. He designed an 11 by 7 block rectangle, a clean grid of 70 square blocks carved out of the wilderness. Straight streets, uniform lots. An orderly European design surrounded on all sides by swamp. He named the streets after French royalty and Catholic saints. Bourbon Street, named for France's ruling family, Chartres, Royal, Toulouse. Names that still mark the same streets today, more than 300 years later. At the center of the grid, facing the river, Poja placed the Place d'Armes, the public square. A small church was built nearby, on the exact spot where the St. Louis Cathedral stands today. This was the anchor point around which everything else would grow. Then, in September 1722, a hurricane struck the city and blew most of the structures down. Every provisional building Bienville's men had thrown together was destroyed. But here's the thing, the hurricane actually helped. With the old buildings gone, Podger could finally enforce his grid. The streets were surveyed properly. New structures followed the plan. Out of destruction, the layout of one of America's most famous neighborhoods was born, and you can still walk it today. The French Quarter is Podger's grid, virtually unchanged for 3 centuries. 6 years after the city's founding, Louisiana officials adopted the Code Noir, the Black Code, a set of laws that would define the colony's relationship with slavery, religion, and race for the next 80 years. The Code Noir was contradictory in ways that revealed the colony's deepest tensions. It required slave owners to baptize their enslaved people as Catholics. It forbade working on Sundays and religious holidays. It mandated that enslaved people be properly fed and housed. On paper, it imposed limits on cruelty. But it also classified human beings as property. It authorized brutal punishments. And it made the entire economy dependent on forced labor. One provision would have consequences nobody could have predicted. The Code Noir established Sundays as a day of rest for enslaved Africans. No law granted them the right to gather. But with Sundays free, enslaved people began meeting in remote spots around the city, along the levees, in backyards, in clearings outside the settlement, and in one open space just beyond the city walls on the backside of Rampart Street. They started doing something that had never been seen anywhere else in North America. They started playing music. This is Congo Square. Today, it sits inside Louis Armstrong Park in the Treme neighborhood, the oldest African-American neighborhood in New Orleans. A historical marker stands at the edge of the square. Bronze statues of musicians line the park. It looks peaceful, almost ordinary. But what happened here for over a century was anything but ordinary. Every Sunday, enslaved and free people of African descent gathered in this open space to drum, dance, sing, and trade goods. Under French and then Spanish rule, the gatherings were tolerated. Enslaved people set up markets, sold food and handmade goods, and some even earned enough money to buy their own freedom through a Spanish legal process called coartación. Groups organized by ethnic heritage, Senegambian, Congo, Yoruba, each took their own area of the square. Musicians played bambula drums, instruments made from gourds and banzas, an ancestor of the banjo. They performed dances like the bambula, the kalinda, the Congo. Visitors described hearing the drums from blocks away. By 1819, the Sunday gatherings attracted up to 600 people. Enslaved Africans wore decorations of animal tails, fringes, ribbons, and bells that jingled as they danced. Women wore silk and muslin dresses. Men wore clothing inspired by styles from across the diaspora. Different tribal groups occupied different sections of the square, each with their own musicians and their own rhythms. Nothing like this existed anywhere else in the United States. In Protestant colonies, African language, music, and tradition had been systematically suppressed. But in Catholic Louisiana, under the Code Noir's provision for Sunday rest, African culture didn't just survive, it thrived. The rhythms that echoed through Congo Square are found at the core of what would eventually become ragtime, blues, and jazz. Second-line parades, Mardi Gras Indian traditions, brass band funeral processions. All of it traces back to this single patch of ground. But there was a darker side too. Congo Square also hosted public executions, cockfights, and at times the sale of enslaved people. Beauty and brutality occupying the same ground on the same afternoon. That was colonial New Orleans. Today the Sunday drum circles continue. Every week musicians and dancers gather in the square to keep the tradition alive. You can walk in and hear the same rhythms that enslaved Africans played here 300 years ago. On Chartres Street, a few blocks from the cathedral, stands a building that has survived everything this city has thrown at it. Hurricanes, fires, floods, wars. 3 different colonial governments. The old Ursuline convent, completed in 1752, is the oldest surviving structure in the Mississippi River Valley and the last intact example of French colonial architecture in the United States. The Ursuline nuns arrived in New Orleans in 1727, just 9 years after the city was founded. They came to run a hospital and a school for girls, but they walked into something closer to a disaster zone. The colony was still barely functional. Disease was everywhere. The men outnumbered women dramatically, and the Company of the West had been sending shiploads of women from French poorhouses and prisons in a desperate attempt to stabilize the population. An earlier group of young French women had arrived with their possessions in small trunks, called cassettes. They became known as the casket girls. Local legend says that when they arrived, their trunks were stored in the convent's upper floors, and that some of those trunks contained something other than clothing. Vampire legends still surround the building to this day. The shutters on the 3rd floor are said to be nailed shut. Whether you believe the stories or not, the building is considered one of the most haunted sites in the city. What's not legend is what the nuns accomplished. They ran the colony's first hospital. They educated girls of every race, including indigenous and African children, something almost unheard of in colonial America. They nursed the sick through epidemics that killed colonists by the hundreds. And when the Great Fire of 1788 swept through the city and destroyed almost everything, the nuns prayed to Our Lady of Prompt Succor. As the flames approached the convent, the wind shifted direction. The building survived. It's still there. You can walk inside for the price of a museum ticket and stand in the same rooms where those nuns lived through the colony's darkest years. Good Friday, March 21st, 1788. The Spanish Army's paymaster, Don Vicente José Núñez, was praying at a private altar in his home at the corner of Chartres and Toulouse streets, less than a block from the Place d'Armes. He had lit up to 50 tall taper candles. When he stepped out to attend to dinner, the candles caught the drapes. Within minutes, the flames had reached the roof. Strong winds from the southeast drove the fire through 18 blocks of tightly packed wooden buildings. Cypress timber, bark roofs, everything burned. And because it was Good Friday, the priest refused to ring the church bells. Traditionally, church bells were not rung on Good Friday. The clergy would not bend the rule, even to warn the city of an approaching inferno. Without any alarm system, the fire spread unchecked for 5 hours. By the next morning, 856 of the city's 1,100 structures were gone. The church, the municipal building, the army barracks, the armory, the jail, every bakery in the city, the principal mansions, all of it reduced to ash. No effort was made to save the prisoners. They all perished. The Spanish governor, Esteban Miro, set up tents along the riverbank for the homeless. He broke Spanish law by sending ships to Philadelphia for emergency flour, then begged the King of Spain for forgiveness after the fact. He fixed prices to prevent inflation and called on farmers along the Mississippi to send food. The city survived, but it would never look the same. Just 6 years later, on December 8, 1794, another fire broke out in nearly the same area. This time, 212 more buildings burned, including the royal jail. Prisoners had to be transferred to a ship anchored in the river. 2 fires. Over 1,000 buildings destroyed. Nearly the entire colonial city erased. But here's what makes this story remarkable. The fires are the reason the French Quarter looks the way it does today. After the disasters, Spanish authorities enacted strict new building codes. No more exposed cypress timbers. Buildings had to be constructed with brick covered in stucco with flat tile roofs instead of flammable shingles. Houses had to be built at the sidewalk line, not set back, so firefighters could reach them. Courtyards, thick walls, wrought iron balconies forged by Spanish craftsmen. The French Quarter is actually Spanish. Almost everything you see when you walk those streets today was built after the fires under Spanish colonial rule. The cabildo, the presbytere, the rebuilt St. Louis Cathedral, all designed by Spanish architect Gilberto Guillemard, all paid for by a wealthy Andalusian named Don Andrés Almonesta y Rojas. The city that burned as French was reborn as Spanish, and that's the city you visit today. Standing at the center of Jackson Square, you're looking at three buildings that define the city. On the left, the Cabildo, completed in 1799. This was the headquarters of the Spanish colonial government. The building where laws were made, disputes settled, and colonial power displayed. It would later become the site of the Louisiana Purchase transfer in 1803. The moment this city changed hands for the last time. Its thick columns, arched openings, and wrought iron balconies are pure Spanish colonial design. It's been compared to the Cabildo in Oaxaca, Mexico, and government buildings across the Spanish-American Empire. In the center, the St. Louis Cathedral. The first church on this site was built in the 1720s, just a few years after the city's founding. The one standing now is the third version, rebuilt after both fires and redesigned in the 1850s. But the site itself has been sacred ground since Bienville drew a mark in the soil with his sword to choose its location. It's the oldest continuously active Roman Catholic cathedral in the United States. On the right, the presbytere, started in 1791, originally intended as a residence for the cathedral's clergy. Its wealthy Spanish backer died before it was finished, and the American government eventually completed it after the Louisiana Purchase. Today it houses a museum dedicated to Mardi Gras. 3 buildings, 3 colonial powers, French origins, Spanish construction, American completion. That's the story of New Orleans in architecture. Walk down Bourbon Street past the neon and the noise, and at the corner of Bourbon and St. Philip, you'll find something that doesn't quite fit. A dark, weathered building with thick walls of brick between posts, flickering candlelight inside, and no electric signs. Lafitte's blacksmith shop was built sometime between 1722 and 1732. That makes it among the oldest surviving structures in New Orleans, and one of the oldest buildings in the Mississippi Valley. It's also been operating as a bar for longer than anyone can verify. The building is named for Jean Lafitte, a pirate and privateer who, along with his brother Pierre, allegedly used this location as a front for smuggling operations in the early 1800s. The port of New Orleans attracted smugglers, privateers, and pirates throughout the colonial era. The flow of goods between the Gulf and the Mississippi made it irresistible. The architecture itself is remarkable. French colonial briquette entrepotteau construction, brick between posts, one of the last examples of this building technique in the city. While virtually every other French colonial structure burned in the fires of 1788 and 1794, this one survived. Today it serves drinks by candlelight. Tennessee Williams used to drink here, so did Noel Coward. You can sit inside a building that's older than the United States, in a room that's barely changed in 3 centuries, and order a cocktail. Voodoo came to New Orleans in the early 1700s, carried by enslaved Africans from the western coast of Africa. It was not what popular culture has made it. It was a serious spiritual system, rooted in West African religious traditions, connecting communities to their ancestors and to a world of spirits. In Louisiana, something unusual happened. Instead of being destroyed, as it was in most Protestant colonies, Voodoo merged with the dominant religion of the colony, Catholicism. The French and Spanish colonial authorities required enslaved people to be baptized as Catholics. But rather than replacing African spiritual traditions, Catholicism was absorbed into them. The voodoo deity, Legba, who controls the gates to the spirit world, became identified with St. Peter, who holds the keys to the gates of heaven. Other spirits were matched to other saints. The result was a hybrid unlike anything else in the Americas. New Orleans Voodoo. Voodoo ceremonies took place in the same spaces where the Code Noir allowed Sunday gatherings, in Congo Square, along the bayous, in private homes throughout the Treme and the French Quarter. The spiritual practices were inseparable from the music, the dance, and the community life that defined Black New Orleans. The most famous practitioner was Marie Laveau, the Voodoo Queen of New Orleans. A free woman of color, a devout Catholic who attended Mass at St. Louis Cathedral, and one of the most powerful, unofficial figures in the city's history. She adopted orphans, fed the hungry, visited prisoners, and nursed yellow fever victims. Her tomb in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 is still one of the most visited sites in the city. Voodoo wasn't entertainment. It wasn't superstition. It was survival. A way for enslaved people to hold on to something that belonged to them in a world designed to strip everything away. You can't build underground tombs in a city that sits below the water table. Dig a grave in New Orleans and it fills with water. Early colonists learned this the hard way when coffins floated to the surface after heavy rains. The solution was above-ground burial. Brick and stone tombs, stacked in rows, forming what locals call the cities of the dead. St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, opened in 1789, just a year after the Great Fire, is the oldest surviving cemetery in the city. Walk through its narrow pathways, and you're moving between tombs that hold centuries of the city's dead. French colonists, Spanish officials, free people of color, enslaved Africans, yellow fever victims buried by the thousands. The tombs are designed to function as ovens in the Louisiana heat. A body placed inside decomposes within a year, and the remains are pushed to the back to make room for the next family member. Efficient, practical, and deeply unsettling if you think about it too long. Marie Laveau's tomb is here. So are the remains of some of the city's most prominent colonial families. And every November 1st, on All Saints' Day, families still come to whitewash and clean the tombs and decorate them with fresh flowers. A tradition that stretches back to the colonial period. Standing here looking back at these moments, it's hard not to feel something. This city was founded as a scam, built by prisoners and enslaved Africans, on land that floods, burns, and breeds disease. Colonial officials wrote letters saying it couldn't survive. Investors abandoned it. Hurricanes flattened it. Fire destroyed it, not once, but twice. And the people who actually built it, who dug the ditches and raised the levees and constructed the buildings, were the same people who were owned as property. And yet, from the darkest conditions came the most extraordinary culture. The rhythms played by enslaved Africans in Congo Square became jazz. The fusion of African spirituality and Catholicism became voodoo. The Spanish buildings that rose from French ashes became one of the most beautiful neighborhoods in America. The food, the music, the language, the architecture, all of it born from collision. French, Spanish, African, Caribbean, indigenous, all forced together in a swamp that nobody wanted. New Orleans didn't overcome its darkness. It was made from it. The French quarter grid that Porra drew in 1721 is still the street map. The St. Louis Cathedral still stands where Bienville drew his mark in the soil. The Ursuline Convent still stands on Chartres Street. Congo Square still hosts drum circles on Sundays. Lafitte's blacksmith shop still serves drinks by candlelight. The cities of the dead still hold the remains of 3 centuries of the city's people. Every one of these places is a site you can visit today. New Orleans was never supposed to work. A city below sea level, built on a swamp, destroyed by fire, ravaged by disease, and sustained by the labor of people who were never free. It broke every rule of what a city should be. And it's still here, 300 years later, still standing, still playing music, still refusing to die. If there's another city, another moment in time, or a historic scene you'd like to see brought back to life, let me know in the comments. I'd love to keep building this journey into the past with you. Thank you so much for watching.